Thank you for listening to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Sign up to our Patreon to receive bonus content, live streams, and our weekly newsletter with money off books and museum visits as well, plus early access to all live show tickets. That's patreon.com/wehaveways.
This season, a new hot deal has arrived at Metro. $25 a line for 4 lines with all the data you need and 4 free Samsung Galaxy A15 5G phones. Getting Metro's best deals is easy. No ID required, no activation fees. Get a new number or keep your own. It's up to you. That's 4 lines for $25 a line, plus 4 free phones. Visit a store or go online today. Only at Metro by T-Mobile.
When you join Metro Plus Tax. For a limited time and subject to change. Max 1 offer per account.
Take your plans out of the group chat and get long weekend ready in new Abercrombie. From day to night, pack new outfits for every part of your itinerary. Grabbing brunch? Throw on the A&F Mila dress. Then head to your dinner reservation in their new bubble hem mini dress. And yes, permission to overpack for pics with the girls. Abercrombie's best-selling Scarlet Squirt deserves a post in your feed. Your plans are worth it. Shop Abercrombie's new long weekend collection online or in store.
Achtung, welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk, USA, our American, your tandem, sidecar. I can't think of the right expression, John.
Brothers in arms.
Spin-off.
Brothers in arms.
Spin-off.
A special
Yes,
relationship, allies. Coalition partners.
Absolutely. 100%. Yep.
So what we thought we'd do, well, James and I have just done a series about the Battle of the Bulge and also have been to walk the ground in the Ardennes, been very much on our minds. And what we wanted to do for you, sweet listener, if you've made your way to the end of that series, which was supposed to be 4 episodes and turned into sort of 58. Suddenly
There's a lot to say.
I mean, suddenly you realise you haven't done 7th Army. Like, oh no. Anyway, what we thought we'd do is talk to John, pick his brains with some questions from you as listeners as well. Jim also is in Freiburg.
Yep.
Right this moment, looking at the German archive with the help of ChatGPT as well, interestingly, which can translate then and there, which must be a fascinating way.
Then and there. It's just amazing. It is absolutely amazing. And actually, this is a tiny little rabbit hole, which I'm not going to linger on. But I found this piece yesterday written by this SS journalist at the front called, what was his name? Achim Gerner or something like that. And anyway, it's this incredible piece that he's written after the July plot. It is the biggest load of tosh you ever read. It is just remarkable, and it is, it is amazing how a nation could fall so blindly for this absolute balderdash, which is what he's writing. Anyway, I shall, after this, I'll send it over to both of you. But I've also been looking at interviews with Otto Rehmer, remember him, from the Führerbegleiter Brigade, loads of the commanders, loads of the divisional commanders, corps commanders, all the rest of it, as well as some eyewitness accounts of sort of ordinary folk. And one of the guys is 3rd SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment commander. And it's after the Twin Villages battle. It's the 22nd of December. So by this time, the action's moved up onto the Elsenborn Ridge, beyond Rockerath and Krinkelt. And he says, I walked up there, I couldn't get any vehicle anywhere near, so I had to go on foot. In places, the mud was up to 5 feet deep.
Oh my God.
From all the vehicles that are crossed over. 5 feet! I mean,
talk about a sea of
that's
mud.
worse than Passchendaele. I mean, he's obviously exaggerating, but even so, I mean,
incredible.
And the amount of times, John, where they've saying, well, the big problem was, we didn't have enough vehicles, we couldn't maneuver our tanks in the way we wanted to, so we were over dependent on Panzer Grenadiers and half tracks. We didn't have enough fuel. The ambition for the operation was too great for the means we were given, etc., etc. It's literally the same every time, and you're going, well, yeah, obviously. I mean, that's the problem.
I'm curious, did the 3rd Panzer Grenadier guy talked about getting choke pointed in the Twin Villages and the danger for American infantry and anti-tank weapons?
No, but he did say even going through the woods was difficult because the retreating Americans had laid lots of mines.
Yeah, and those woods are thick. I mean, they really are.
Yeah. Don't we know it? I mean,
incredibly dense. And the Twin Villages battle is very much infantrymen skirmishing with anti-tank weapons. The 57mm gun is man-portable enough that you can drag it around the corner and get one off and then get away. That bazookas are effective at very short range from the windows of a building or from a ditch or whatever. I think it's really interesting, isn't it? Because so many tank encounters in the Second World War, you're immediately thinking, well, is it tank on tank? But actually,
hardly ever.
These German superior panzers, so-called, are coming unstuck because of infantry resisting stubbornly and with man-portable anti-tank weapens. It's really interesting.
Do you remember that amazing episode, that account by that guy, Willy Fischer, who was in the 12th SS? And he's in... Krinkelt, isn't he? Or is he in Rockeraff? I can't remember. He's in the Twin Villages. And he can see the 57mm anti-tank gun, towed gun, maneuvering, anticipating his move. And he can't do anything about it because they can maneuver their 57mm faster than he can maneuver.
Yeah, so I wrote about this in pretty good depth in a book I did called Grunts and went really deep into it. It was a really deep dive into Krinkelt and Rockeraff. And it was just amazing to me how many times you've got American infantry with their bazookas, a lot of times on the second floor of a building. And it's the Germans, that advantage of this thicker armor that it would fight at distance against a Sherman, something like that, it's all negated there because they're just sort of maneuvering in this town the best they can. And infantry is popping up everywhere where they don't want them to be. And they're either damaging the tanks or they're forcing the crews to leave the tanks, which is more or less the same thing. Yep. And then the dismounted crews then are in the middle of this whole mishmash of building to building fights. It's really an interesting battle to study from that standpoint of what infantry can do in that constricted semi-urban environment of this village of building to building. The 57mm pieces are really effective, because of that close range, but also just the dismounted guy with hauling a bazooka around or whatever, or grenades. That too. It was crazy.
I've got 2 points to make to this. First of all, your book Grunts is absolutely fantastic. It was the first book I bought of yours, and I must have bought it 20 years ago. The other one to mention, of course, is Alamo in the Ardennes, which you wrote. So you've got the 2 books about that, and obviously you've just been there a zillion times. You've toured around it. You were touring around it in December, so it's ground you know incredibly well. The second point I was going to make is that when Al and I were in L'Église, which was the kind of sort of end game for Kampfgruppe Piper, which we did in episode 5 of our Battle of the Bulge series, we were sat at the end of the day. The sun was going down. It was kind of it was dusk, and we were sat by that enormous King Tiger in the square. And you're just thinking, these things were designed for the Russian steppe. They're just not designed for these kind of narrow villages. And again, you see the Germans just constantly trying to kind of sort of fit the wrong things into the wrong terrain.
Well, it's designed for the Russian steppe, but also for the conspicuous consumption of the Führer. It's not like a committee has designed that tank that's been sent away. It hasn't been designed in Cobham, has it, by British tank people or by Vickers Armstrong or whoever. It's been designed with an eye to getting the nod from the boss, and bigger is better. The fact that vehicle, which is the product of that thought process, ends up stuck in a village in an offensive that is the product of that same mind. It's too on the nose.
It's quite impressive that it actually got into that.
Well,
square,
it's pretty impressive, but it's too on the nose to write. You wouldn't write it. The whole thing, from conception to its destruction, it's all one guy influencing things to the point of it being ridiculous. Anyway,
it's a monument to the cult of personality, the megalomania, the egomania, all those things that are his undoing ultimately. And it's a monument that's literally there today, like you said.
That is the problem when you have a rampant ego and narcissism. You tend to get unstuck.
Yep, you do. That's how that works.
I mean, it's interesting though, isn't it? One of the things I've been sort of looking at as well as tank destroyer doctrine, that the Americans have this idea of the tank destroyer, even to the point where ammunition is prioritized towards it, so that when you do get a 76mm Sherman, they'll get the ammunition if they can, but it's prioritized to the tank destroyer arm. That's McNair, his bright idea from earlier in the war before the Americans have actually had to do any of that kind of fighting. And yet, actually, the towed 57mm anti-tank gun in that circumstance is fine. win, isn't it? Yeah. You don't need Hellcats. You don't need mechanized stuff.
No.
You need guys prepared to stick to the plate, which is actually the issue, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
And who know what they're doing.
And who know what they're doing and have been well trained enough on a piece of kit that's pretty reliable. And there it is, And also small unit initiative, mission command. I mean, this is the other thing Jim and I talked about a lot is that, when you look at the German effort, their units actually are quite disparate and also are in conflict with one another, certainly in command conflict with one another. The Fallschirmjäger, who are sort of shadow of themselves, with Luftwaffe officers and then doughty NCOs.
And then competition between 5th Panzer Army and 6th Panzer Army and Waffen-SS and Wehrmacht. It's an absolute
Raymer's people who are sort of apart but not a part of things. And it's this sort of, when you look at it, the American army fight with homogeneity. That's the word that came up, wasn't it, Jim?
It is.
Yeah.
Everyone's been trained to a certain standard, a certain level. The guys who stick around, you don't need to teach them mission command because they've already got it. It exists.
Exactly. And what is so impressive about the way the Americans respond to this totally unprecedented blow is the speed with which they organize themselves into task forces and teams of all arms. And, think about Lieutenant Hayduke, just to the east of Bastogne. Is it Cherry? Colonel Cherry, I think is his commander. Henry Cherry's in town. He can't get back because the Panzerlehr's gone in the middle of him, so he's stuck there. So Hayduke's on his own. He's the first lieutenant, and he's there, and, they get destroyed because the Panzerlehr are coming from the other direction. But suddenly you've got probably a 24-year-old, 23-year-old first lieutenant commanding this combined force of troops, most of whom he's never worked with before, in an ad hoc basis. And that battle, although they lose, still holds up Panzerlehr a day. And a day counts for a huge amount in this battle. And it's incredibly impressive, the speed with which, and alacrity with which comparatively junior officers, captains, lieutenants, majors, half colonels, are just gripping the situation, operating with people they're not familiar with, and making these stands. It's incredible.
McKinley at Loudstall Crossroads. I mean, it's just absolutely amazing.
Loudstall Crossroads.
Classic example. I mean, really, I think from McNair on down, there's a prioritization of combined arms and of fighting that way. And I think that's partially the key to this, and to melding together different experiential levels. So like the Twin Village is a really good example, because the second ID obviously is a very experienced formation. And by the way, had been in the middle of its own offensive when the Bulge starts, and had to be reoriented down to that neighborhood. The 99th Division, which is also pretty intimately involved in the area. Obviously that one's brand new to combat. Both fight equally well. And I think that's a little bit of a microcosm there too. And, like you said, Jim, in terms of being able to put together these scratch forces, the classic example is east of Bastogne with teams Desaubry, Cherry, and O'Hara that are, again, like I said, combined arms organizations that's very, very effective for doing what you need to do at that moment, which is basically to cost the Germans time and casualties. And they absolutely do that.
Yeah, with bells on. I mean, takeaway for me from the whole thing is the point that you made, Al, which is it's always seen as Hitler's last gamble, but gamble suggests that it's got a chance of success, and it clearly doesn't have any chance of success whatsoever. I mean, zero. And the second takeaway is just how impressive the Americans are. It is incredible how quickly they maneuver and organize themselves, and they make far better, even though they've got more vehicles and heavier vehicles overall, they make much more use of the road network more effectively and swiftly than the Germans do. And the Germans, after all, are supposed to be the ones with the operational art, with the operational skill. I think that's really, really important. The other thing is, John, I'd be really interested to hear your take on this. Al and I came to the conclusion that actually the criticisms that have been directed towards the Allied High Command and 1st Army and 12th Army Group for not anticipating this and not reacting quickly are actually a bit unfair, because Bradley made the point that he didn't see it coming because there's no obvious strategic objectives in that. And he's right. I mean, you can sort of try and second guess your enemy, but you can't second guess someone who's making completely irrational, stupid decisions.
There's no doubt. And I mean, first of all, Ultra has kind of dried up because Hitler knows there's some kind of leak, and thus the communication nodes are a little bit different than they had been. Second of all, obviously the weather has them very good, and that negates the effectiveness of photo recon. The other thing too, even if you do know the offensive is coming, I don't know that there's all that much you can do about it, in the sense that in the wider theater as a whole, you're really starting to run a short of combat manpower in the U.S. Army at that point. And part of it is our prioritization for that manpower for other things, aviation, sea power, so on and so forth. And we're really running up against that. And so, as Bradley had, I think, properly called it, calculated risk, he understood that that was a thinly held sector and this made them vulnerable. But he felt that maybe the terrain would do some of the work for them, in the sense that it was hard for any attacker to maneuver in the Ardennes and, you know, all those things we know about.
And he was right.
And he's right about that. It's small comfort to us if we're part of that 3.5 divisions that's on the wrong side of this tidal wave coming. But so I do think, but the interesting dynamic that I found that's happening, you know, during the days leading up to the Bulge is from the privates on up, there's a sense that something's in the offing, that the Germans are up to something, and each like pushing it up to the higher level and convinced that they don't really quite understand it. So I think from like a sergeant's perspective, the Germans are clearly up to something, because there's an accumulation of strength, and you know, things are different. He's convinced, you know, that the lieutenant doesn't understand, the captain's convinced, the colonel doesn't understand, and on up, all the way up to Bradley himself at 12th Army Group, because it's Middleton who kind of complains to Bradley, you know, Middleton, the 8th Corps commander, that's basically around Bastogne. So, but again, like, what are you going to do? Are you going to reorient everybody away from 6th Army Group to come up to help you? Is 3rd Army going to be basically told to stop in its offensive operations to the east to come up and man the Ardennes? Is 9th Army going to be brought down? I don't know. I you know, great. It's wonderful in hindsight if we can say we know all this, but I don't think anybody realized.
Kind of, you know, the small glimmer of winter sun kind of creeps over the landscape. Sure. I mean, you know, it makes no sense to launch an attack there. So I think the accusations of intelligence failure and the kind of sort of finger pointing over that, I think, are completely misplaced.
Well, or they illustrate the limitations that necessarily come with intelligence. You cannot ever get inside the mind of your opponent, not quite. And after all, Ultra offers you what? He offers you dispositions and the presence of headquarters and things like that. But it doesn't tell you what you're going to do necessarily. You know, inevitably, Ultras come up in this conversation because certainly in this country, in our popular history culture, Ultra means we know what the German generals are having for breakfast. We know when they take a shit. we know they're in a thoughts, and it took 2 years off the war or whatever and all that. Whereas actually, it's part of a complex picture in which some things come into focus out of the fog and other things disappear back into it. And I mean, I think it is interesting because at that stage of the war, the Ultra's fallen away, but it's also the stage of the war where there's so much Ultra, they don't know what to do with it all. Yeah. Generally, where it's a complete torrent. And how do you pick your winner when you're trying to figure out what the German runners and riders are? You know, it's part of the story.
I'll make a provocative statement here.
Go on.
From a ground combat commander's perspective, Ultra is really kind of overrated. Ultra, to me, has a much greater effect on the Battle of the Atlantic and certainly the aviation side of the house, the bigger strategic understanding of what their diplomatic intentions are, things like that. But if you're talking about, for me, as a division commander or a corps commander or a regimental commander, giving me actionable, tangible, intelligence, Ultra, there's hardly any time in the war when that happens. I think maybe at Mortain, and even then, the 30th Division for a day or two is out there, dealing with mostly the whole offensive. Ultra, in fact, kind of screws us over in a way from ground combat perspective in Sicily when Eisenhower decides to withhold from the 82nd Airborne Division and the assaulting amphibious divisions the presence of 2 German divisions there. Yeah. And so we basically go in blind because Ultra is too valuable to risk to brief us on the German presence. So if that's the situation for me, fighting them on the ground, how is there any value? So to me, and about the Bulge, I think maybe is the class example too. So I'm not saying it's nothing, but I'm saying maybe it's a bit overrated in terms of the effect for ground combat commanders, not overall.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough.
No, it's absolutely fair. There was a question I was dying to ask you about 10 minutes ago, John.
What have we been doing then?
What do you attribute the fact that the Americans are able to deal with this kind of thing so well? What is it about the American army at this stage that means, and we're not denying here that a lot of guys are taken prisoner and a lot of guys do decide the fighting isn't for them, because there's St. Michael's Grotto, isn't there? There's an incident where a bunch of blokes are dropped off in trucks and a good portion of them go, no, we're going back to Bastogne, thanks very much, not interested in being here in this outpost. You'll never ever get me criticising that from my point of view. But to what does one attribute the fact that the Americans can pull these formations together, that you do have this, mixture of people from all sorts of different units, and yet they're able, is it the leadership, is it the training, or is that the Mobius strip, of course, that the leadership is the training is the leadership, the one can't function without the other, blah, blah, blah.
I think this is actually one of Eisenhower's Eisenhower's finest moments, because I do think that he recognizes what's actually going on at a pretty early moment. And I think that really manifests in the fact that then he's going to send a lot of combat power into the Bulge area, into the Ardennes. And so the fact that gets going within the first day or so of the offensive is very bad news for the Germans, because it means that we're reorienting the power we've already got that's been perhaps dispersed elsewhere to deal with their offensive. I think that's a big part of it. I do think, too, there's a kind of resilience that the U.S. Armed Forces have demonstrated from the start of the war, from Pearl Harbor onward. They definitely can take a punch. You've seen that in the Philippines in 41 and 42. We're used to coming back, I guess. And we have this intrinsic strength in Eisenhower's theater that then is going to be reoriented in this direction. And I think the ability to move fast, too, in terms of vehicles, I think is crucial. Plus, we don't necessarily have to worry about the fact that as we're moving divisions into the sector, that they're going to get attacked by the Luftwaffe and pinned down or whatever. Yeah. So there is, what we've invested in aviation has really paid off there, too. Even though obviously the Germans have some aerial component to their offensive, it doesn't impede at all with the presence of these U.S. divisions coming into play within the first day or week or whatever it would happen to be. And I think really all those factors are crucial.
Right.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because also at these last stands, the Americans take untold casualties. I mean, they're getting absolutely hammered. And, there's a lot of criticism, sort of broad criticism of the Americans in the war as being unshaven and lacking discipline and calling, officers by their first name and looking slovenly and all the rest of it. But who gives a damn about any of that when you're fighting ferociously on Monte Altuzzo on the Gothic line, or at Schmidt, or when you're fighting at the Lawsdale Crossroads and getting absolutely hammered? I mean, what is the motivation for these guys to do this in a muddy, cold, wet crossroads in the back arse of nowhere in Belgium if you're from California or Texas or North Dakota or something? Why would you? And again, it goes back to this bigger ideal. You do it for your mates and all the rest of it. But you do it because in the Second World War, it was the right thing to do.
For sure. They did believe in the war, and they believed that it had to be won. And they believed that this was a moment when, that it could be lost. And it sure looked that way at the time for many of them. In many cases, I think that they felt they had no choice but to fight, especially those fighting against SS units along the northern shoulder of the Bulge. Post-Malmedy massacre, whereas, the word of that spreads like wildfire, of course. I think some of them felt, well, there's really no alternative but to fight. And in many cases, they're getting orders, which I think are just chilling. Hold at all costs. And all costs means all of us.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. Well, that's sort of my point, really, John. I mean, I think it's incredible.
It is incredible. But I think there's enough fighting cohesion in the army at that point, and confidence in their weapons and whatever, that I think they are going to fight. And I think that's the vast majority. You mentioned, there are those who surrender and who decide, this fight isn't for me. Of course, you always have that. And we see that with a number of the prisoners captured. Of course, some of them are really just checkmated. They don't have much option. They don't have any weapons left or whatever. And so what do they do? But I think largely...
Well, even the 424th and the 423rd, from...
they're checkmated.
They're checkmated. They can't, they've run out of ammunition. They're completely surrounded. What are you supposed to do?
They don't have any ammo. They're surrounded. And exactly. So the disposition is the problem. And you have that. But I think largely the U.S. formations fight really well, both on defense and on offense in the Bulge. And really, it's the latter that's more challenging going forward on some level in terms of casualties, I guess.
Yeah.
Because now, you're vulnerable. Most of the Bulge is that post-Christmas fight all the way through the end of January or so, through increasingly bad weather and difficult circumstances, to retake the ground. The vast majority of the American soldiers who are involved in what we call the Battle of the Bulge are experiencing that part of it, not the more famous first 10 days or whatever. First 10 days buys us time to do that second phase, which, decides the battle.
Well, yes, I mean, because one of the things we talked about a lot is that it's seen as a series of American last stands, but actually what it turns into is a load of German last stands.
It is.
The first 10 days has that, Americans holding them up, being sticky, being difficult, and the siege at Bastogne and those things. But by the end, the shoe is completely on the other foot. And yet it's peculiar, isn't it, that that's not the well-known bit of the battle?
It's because it's the usual, just grinding, day by day, taking casualties, gaining 400 yards kind of thing that is so hard to wrap your mind around.
Yeah. Yes, because after all, it is striking what happens with the offensive when it's launched and the ground that's made and all that sort of stuff. But in the end, I mean, we got very hung up on how pointless it all was, didn't we, Jim, when we were there?
No, definitely. From a German perspective, especially.
From a German perspective, if you were a German, we were talking about this at a sort of hypothetical German mum who loses a son in the Ardennes, and comes to realise in later life that there was no winning, there was nothing on offer there, and his sacrifice is a complete, total waste.
Horrible.
And it's not that he's given his life, it's that his life's been given up by his leadership.
These Volksgrenadier schlubs who are just kind of thrown in and just used as cannon fodder, literally. I mean, many. I mean, it's horrible. Yeah. It really is.
Should we take a break and then come back with some listeners' questions? Because we do have some good questions.
Good idea.
One or two of which I think are actually fascinating. We'll see you in a tick. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk USA with me, Al Murray, James Holland and John McManus. This is excellent cud being chewed, isn't it, Jim?
Yeah, loving it.
Me too.
Now, we had some questions.
Pity we're not having a pint in our hands down a pub, isn't it? A pack of nuts, that's what we're doing. We just get nuts every time we want some nuts.
Well, one of those very nice, there's a couple of very good hostelries in Stavelot, weren't there? There's that one where you had that enormous knuckle of ham, Jim, that you ordered, and I had the worst food ending imaginable.
I nearly had that last night. Well, I intend to be there. I'm going to Clairvaux on Thursday.
Lovely.
After going to the amazing museum in Dekirk, which everyone recommended, which I haven't been to yet.
Museum.
Okay, and that's the military museum there. Yeah, so I'm going there on Thursday. Having been to the Adlerhorst and Schloss Ziegenberg, which is I'm staying in Bad Nauheim.
Nice.
And then I'm back to the Hotel Roanne in Stavelot. Wow.
Really?
Nice. Yeah.
Lovely.
Hopefully I don't do my shoulder in again this time.
That's very, very nice. Very nice, that hotel. Right, we have some questions. Nick Skeet, who's come to us via the Patreon. Thanks for being a Patreon member, Nick. It's a bargain, everyone. Let's just put it that way. Love the pod, gents. Keep helping us discover more. I've always been surprised that the Americans lacked winter clothing. Given they were the best equipped and supplied army on the planet, surely it wasn't as straightforward as nobody had planned that far ahead. John.
So, this is one of those... those elephants in the room about the situation for the U.S. Army in Europe in the fall of 1944, that it's incredible already well before the Bulge. We've got guys on the front in increasingly cold and wet weather who are not properly equipped. It's not a matter of not having the stuff, it's not getting it to where it needs to go. And part of that, I do think, if I'm being as tolerant as possible of the supply folks, part of that is the pressures of global war. That logistically speaking, we are supplying all over the globe and for different kinds of temperatures and operations and circumstances and whatnot. So I think that's partially what's going on here. I also think, though, too, if we're looking at Eisenhower's headquarters, his supply guy, General J.C.H. Lee, the famous Jesus Christ himself, Lee. I'm sorry. Any way we parse this, I know he has defenders. He's not getting it done. And he's not getting it done because I don't think there's enough prioritization to get the stuff to the guy who needs it the most. I think there's way too much preoccupation with rear areas and whatnot with their own comfort level. There's a little bit of corruption there because let's be honest, there's GIs who are on the lam who have gone AWOL into Paris and whatever and have their own black marketeering, and that does us no good. Some of them are combat soldiers who have run away, of course, but regardless, they become part of the problem. There's trucking issues, there's maintenance issues, there's, of course, just, again, from JCH Lee on down, there's not enough of a priority of stripping bare folks in the rear of whatever stuff they need, coats and whatever, to get it to people who need it the most. That isn't the priority. And I believe Eisenhower should have done more to address that. It's just my opinion, though.
It is a glaring feature of the campaign, isn't it? It is,
although that undertop that you put underneath the M43, I would argue was pretty good.
What, the wool shirt? Or
the other day. No, it's a rabbit fur kind of line,
that is good.
Line thing, and you put it underneath your M43 field jacket.
If you can get it at the front, that's the problem. Yeah. For a private or whatever, I mean, it's going to be hard.
Well, but also, I suppose priority is ammunition. When you're in a fix, ammunition, food, and fuel.
It is.
In that order.
And that's fine. Yeah. And I think our footgear is a work in progress, too, because, again, you're trying to design footgear for fighting all over the globe. And so what we need for Pacific Island with coral, sharp coral, is very different than what we're going to need in the Hurtgen Forest. involved. And, so I think that's part of it, too, that it's the larger pressures of global war. But I do think, ironically, that the footgear problem is on the way to being solved. By 45, we're not going to have as many trench foot problems and all that kind of thing. But it's just that the timing is really bad. And the weather doesn't help us out at all. And I think Hurtgen Forest, of course, is the classic example, because as bad as it is with the tree bursts and all that kind of thing, a lot of the casualties are, trench foot and exposure and whatever. And partially that's a kit failure, of course.
I mean, this is kind of related, I think. Nicole Smith, also on the Patreon, asks, what were some of the differences in medical treatment if you were with the Allied forces rather than in German forces during the Battle of the Bulge? I assume in addition to being better supplied, the Allied medical teams had more training. Well, I mean, the difference, it's a chasm, is the truth, isn't it?
Much better equipment. And of course, we'll have to say this with the caveat that if you happen to be in the 326th Airborne Medical Company at Bastogne and get captured and you're at Bastogne in the siege, of course, your medical equipment structure isn't that great. But by and large, for most American soldiers fighting in the Battle of the Bulge, especially in that offensive period, the medical care is really quite good. And a lot of that is just this prioritization from the top down. And I'm talking about from Washington, D.C. on down to have the best possible medical care on the planet for your military forces. And so you've got a medical presence in every kind of unit down to the very spear point and private level. Now that pays off in the Bulge because, of course, obviously there's a lot of casualties who are treated. You've got a lot of medics, like combat medics who are attached to frontline units who really know what they're doing. They're basically like EMTs. You've got all that medical organization infrastructure behind you in the battalion aid stations, the forward hospitals, the field hospitals, the general hospitals, the station hospitals. So there's a lot of ways to get treated. And of course, and then there's the equipment apparatus to back it up. On the German side, I mean, it's likely you may not have bandages, much less, I mean, you have blood plasma on site for a combat medic? Not always.
And as we know, if you get a stomach wound, it's sort of good night Charlie, isn't it?
Good night.
Yeah, and and antibiotics, of course. I mean, you've got penicillin, which is in play by now for the U.S. medical folks. And so, most of that is going, of course, to combat wounded. Some of it is going to treat STDs. There's that too. But really, in the Bulge, the crisis of the Bulge, who knows how many people are saved by penicillin, but also by sulfanilamide, which is another variation of something of the same thing to try and prevent infection for open wounds. That, and of course, I think that the U.S. has gotten very good at blood transfusions. And we all know that bleeding out is the number one cause of death from combat wounds. And so if you can begin to get, proper, blood plasma and transfusion, so on and so forth, as quickly as possible, you can probably save a lot of lives. The cold helps in that way too.
Yes.
You're much more likely to bleed out in hot weather than cold weather when you're frozen up.
Also, I mean, the other thing worth bearing in mind is American nurses are much more attractive, aren't they? And liable
to German generals.
To catch German generals' eyes. And so, I mean, there's the extra combat power of the American nurse.
I've spent years trying to track down who that was, and I've never succeeded. Maybe somebody smarter than I is going to have to get onto that. I wish I could.
But she was a very, very beautiful Fräulein.
That's what he claimed. And I'm like, who would that have been?
Do you think, John? We were most tickled by that story when we were telling it. We were finding it very, very funny. Do you think it's true, or do you think it's byline? Because after all, Piper essentially lies about why he doesn't go into Stavelot. He's exhausted, big long straggling line. His flanks are very vulnerable. He probably only really half knows where he is after all, and all that, and thinks, I'll do it in the morning rather than now, and yet offers excuses in post-war interrogation. Do you think Byline's telling the truth, or?
I'm so old and cynical, I guess, now that I'm very skeptical of the story now than when I first heard it, I guess. But the interesting thing about it, Al, is that it makes Byerline look worse. So you would think he'd be lying in the other direction, wouldn't you? So in case anybody doesn't know about this, he claims to have been transfixed by this beautiful American nurse. She was blonde and beautiful, he said. And so somehow they have captured one of our female nurses. And I would think that'd be a very big story in terms of at the time and later. And the reason I say that is something in the order of about 90 plus female nurses were captured when the Japanese forced the surrender of American military force in the Philippines in 1942. And that, of course, was a major national story. And when eventually they're freed, and they became national celebrities. So this this nurse, whoever she would have been, I would think we would know more about her through the media of the time and then, of course, latter year. But who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. So he claims that he was transfixed by her much of the day. That is the key day when Panzerlehr may have made a difference in basically going in and grabbing Bastogne, which is always a bit ephemeral in my view. But nonetheless, that's what he claims.
Well, yes.
So,
I mean, an alternative way to look at that is that they've been sniped at and spat at all the way through. They were brought into the battle around Clairvaux earlier than they were intending. They've had quite a hard time to just get to Bastogne. And what everyone never really says when they're talking about Panzerlehr arriving at Bastogne or 2nd Panzer going elsewhere or whatever it is, you're talking about the spearheads. You're not talking about 17,000 people, troops and their equipment. You know, these things are the marching order of a panzer division covers 25 miles or something.
Easily.
You know, if not a bit more. I mean, it's a big old area. So what you're talking about arriving in the morning of the, whatever it is, the 19th of December on the southeast edge of Bastogne is the spearhead of a force that has been in combat constantly since it was first deployed and has had very, very little sleep. And you don't want to go into a town with all the incumbent problems that has for an armoured force if you're then going to be repulsed. You know, why wouldn't you wait for everyone to catch up a little bit?
Makes more sense.
And you've also, to make things worse, you've been told that there's an armoured column of American, in brackets, 50 tanks. We know it's not 50 tanks, but it is 30 odd, behind you. So, of course, you're going to go and deal with that. It seems to me entirely reasonable. And I think, you know, all these things are kind of accounted as this terrible mistake, this terrible error of judgment. It's like, I would question anyone else taking a different view to what
I would too.
Bearline did at that moment. I think it's entirely justified, and I don't think you can blame him for it.
Yep. And if he had gone in, he probably would have had that unit cut off and destroyed. And so, you know, but it's just so odd to me that he pointed to that he was too absorbed with trying to woo this nurse.
Well, he doesn't say he was absorbed for a day. He says, we came across we overran this American aid station. There was a very beautiful girl there that caught my eye. And someone else has added 2 and 2 on the kind of, he was out of action all morning. It's because we don't know what he was doing for that morning. But obviously, he was probably busy kind of trying to work out where everyone was and how far the rest of his... You know, I'm sure he wasn't just sitting there twiddling his hands going, Fräulein, you have the most beautiful eyes for 4 hours. I mean, that's absurd.
It seems absurd. I mean...
I like to think that's exactly what he was doing, yeah.
Maybe he got it wrong. Maybe she wasn't American. Maybe she was a local, you know, like René Lemaire working in Bastogne. I don't know. I'm just speculating. It just seems very odd to me that it's been this hard to find the identity of someone who would have been a U.S. military personnel, after all.
I agree with that, but I also think it's very odd that he would say I was transfixed by this beautiful girl if he wasn't.
Right. So someone was there transfixing him, presumably.
Yeah, you'd have thought so.
Just who? And so it's one of those enduring mysteries. I wish I could track that down.
Oh, I like the idea that
one of my many failures, I guess.
He went back to his personal trunk, got his gramophone out, put some tunes on, got some cologne.
Somehow found a single rose.
Exactly.
Maybe a bottle of wine he scared up from somewhere. Yeah.
I am sure I have one bottle of sect somewhere.
What are you doing for Valentine's Day?
Vince's fall is over. Now, John Kay asks, how should we look back on the efforts of post-war politicians like Senator McCarthy in attacking war crimes trials such as those which convicted the perpetrators of the Malmedy massacre? I grew up knowing about the bitter fighting and the terrible things done by the SS and the counterproductive impact this had, and that the US had tried to bring those responsible to justice. It was only much later in life that I learned the full story of the political games played after the war by figures like Tail Gunner Joe in attacking the Malmedy trial. John.
Oh, yeah. Don't even get me started on Tail Gunner Joe. So this really, it's sad because the military justice of the time did find, and bring to justice several of the perpetrators of the Malmedy massacre. And this, I feel, was very, very, very appropriate. A few years later, along comes Senator Joseph McCarthy, and we all know what he was about. Along comes him with this almost kind of zeal for trying to get these guys acquitted or have their sentences reduced or whatever. And like he did with a lot of aspects of his political machinations, he circulates a lot of cock and bull stories about how the interrogations were illegal that produced some of the evidence for the trial, about how these guys were abused and beaten and tortured and all of this kind of stuff. That just really wasn't true. What we have to conclude, I think, in retrospect, is Senator McCarthy certainly he represents an incredibly troubling demagoguery that we'll see, emerge again in American history, but certainly a kind of a crypto-fascism in a way that he's very sympathetic to these Nazis, to these SS guys. He didn't fight in Europe. He fought in the Pacific as a Marine intel officer against the Japanese. So this is a man who is incredibly reckless in his anti-communism and not particularly effective, if you ask me, because he never really finds many real spies. And there was plenty of Soviet espionage in America at that point. So the basic premise was right, but he does next to nothing except to get Americans fearing one another. So this whole thing is such a fiasco, and I think kind of sad that some of the perpetrators aren't punished the way they should have been.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense with him, communism is the weapon rather than the target, isn't it? He's using it
definitely
to attack people and using it to promote his own political career, isn't it? So people are just caught in that crossfire.
Creating a terrible climate of fear. Yep.
Yeah. I think what's really interesting about Malmedy is when we were there in January, I came to sort of see the Piper part of the campaign as the entire thing in microcosm. It sort of represents the whole thing in the way it progresses, the way it ends up, and the stuff they do along the way. It sort of feels like the character of the whole thing. And when we were talking earlier about what's making the doughboy fight, the guy from California, what's making him fight in this set of circumstances? Well, one of the things is the Malmedy massacre. It eludes the censor, it gets the American papers straight away, and also gets round the front line like wildfire. It's discovered that same afternoon, isn't it? And reported immediately. You know perfectly well that it goes straight into what men are saying to each other about what might happen to them and makes them die harder, most likely. And so it's this sort of a core part of what happens in the Bulge, this. And I think that there is an attempt to bring people to justice is absolutely right. And, for all the fact that they're on the move and how are they ever going to take prisoners, all that sort of stuff, whatever, it's completely
Send him walking east, as happened in many, many other places in the Bulge.
Send them walking east.
Exactly.
And also they're on a killing spree anyway, because they're killing civilians at Boniers anyway. Points to the German soldier is brutalised, he's been brought up, and he lives in a brutal society that regards, death for the enemy as a first principle. I find it absolutely remarkable that anyone in America in the years that follow would try and get Piper off.
Yep.
It's sort of
and
mad.
McCarthy did, and he was pretty effective in that campaign, unfortunately.
Crazy.
It really is. Just one of the many examples of the damage McCarthy did during his fortunately kind of brief heyday.
Yeah. Jim,
my question for you, John, really, at the end of all this, and it's been so interesting to walk the ground again, to do this deep dive, to start really looking into the nuts and bolts of it, as well as the human experience of the whole thing. Is this American army in Europe's finest moment, would you say?
That's a great question.
Because I am really bowled over by how impressive the Americans are in this.
I mean, I think it's one of the finest moments. I think that certainly Normandy is right up there too, and this also the dismemberment of Germany itself at the end is pretty professional demolition, I think. But I mean,
but it's
in terms
because
of,
they're put on the back foot and how they respond to the back foot.
Yeah, exactly.
You've got the defensive battle, you've got the holding the line, then you've got the counter punch. Put that collectively, you're bringing to bear the American skills that they've developed since before they go into action in North Africa in November 1942, the lessons they've learned in all that time. It all seems to sort of coagulate in the snow, the mud, the rain, the misery of deep midwinter in the Ardennes in Belgium in an incredibly effective way.
It's the resilience is amazing.
And it's one of the reasons why the war in, the Americans and why the British and the Canadians get as far as they do, and why the Americans get to the River Elbe is because of the clinical way in which they destroy the bulk of German armor in the West in the Battle of the Bulge. I mean, it's just I think it's just so impressive. And I go back to kind of Lowestoft Crossroads and Lieutenant Hayduke and
Bauk.
and all these people. It's so impressive, and also the clinical way in which Second Panzer is completely destroyed at Celle and elsewhere.
And Deauville.
Kampfgruppe Kochenhausen just completely annihilated in this wood, in this the edge of the village. I mean, it's just it's so impressive. And also, frankly, the way Kampfgruppe Piper is dismantled.
Mm-hmm. It is just gnawed away as it moves sort of northwest, and it becomes more vulnerable every day. Yeah, it's just set upon by these enemy units. And
I just find it hard to sort of criticize any part of it. Really, I mean, obviously, there's things in retrospect that you would have done differently, but overall, it's really, really impressive.
Yeah, the interesting thing about it that kind of lives on, and I can't think of this as from too many other battles, especially in Europe, is that one of the most prolific and prominent veterans associations in this country was the Veterans of the Battle of the Bulge. You really didn't quite have that for Normandy or Italy or whatever. There was a camaraderie of those who were involved in this battle because of how they had dealt with what was really perhaps the greatest crisis of the entire campaign in Europe, and that they had won what many felt was the biggest mostly American victory in our modern military history. And all the conditions they had endured, not just the Germans, but all the cold and the adversity, and sometimes the lack of food and the footgear, all that kind of stuff. It's really quite interesting because you're talking about people from a lot of different divisions, and that in many cases fought in very different places, far apart from one another, and yet they are all part of this organization called Veterans of the Battle of the Bulge, which was so dynamic and still exists. And there's a few veterans left, but it's mainly the children and the grandchildren now who drive it forward. I can't think of anything like that for Normandy, as prominent as it was. And I think that's quite interesting when you look back on it.
That's fascinating.
So I think it speaks to what you're saying, Jim.
I've one last thing before we go. Do you think actually that it's portrayed as, stymieing Allied plans and holding up the war and all that? I came away thinking it actually speeds the war up. The Germans basically throw away their strategic reserve and bleed themselves exactly the moment where what they ought to be doing is licking their wounds and reorganising properly. Would you agree with that?
Reorganising on the other side of the Rhine would be the obvious thing to do.
Yes. No, I agree 100%. I think it absolutely accelerated the end of the war. I mean, these were, so if let's say the Germans lose, 80 to 110,000 casualties, something like that. I mean, a lot of those are people they can never replace. And a lot of those are vehicles and weaponry that can't be replaced. And of course, by the way, they're about to get nailed by Allied armies east and west, as 1945 unfolds. So it just stands to reason that you don't have some of your better formations available to deal with that. And I think it's one of the reasons why the war ends when it does. I don't know that we can really put an actual time frame on it. No. But to me, just rationality tells us that once you remove those assets from the German order of battle, that's certainly going to be to their detriment. So it's kind of makes you shudder to think about it in retrospect, how tough it would have been in Germany in 1945 to conquer it if the Bulge hadn't happened. Because, I mean, you guys know this, that, when you really study those battles in 1945, they were really tough. The level of violence and all that, even pretty well into April. I think I've mentioned this before, but it bears repeating. The casualty rates in the U.S. Army in April 1945 are almost as high as they had been in Normandy the previous summer. So there was still a hell of a lot of fighting going on. And absent the Bulge, that's probably going to be worse. So I agree with you 100%.
Okay, good. Well,
an American epic. There you go.
An American epic. And thanks so much for joining us for this, John. And we will see you at We Have Waste Fest, so people can ask you the questions that didn't get asked personally, which is in September, the 12th to 14th September. WeHaveWasteFest.co.uk. Thanks everyone for listening. Jim, have fun in Germany and then in Belgium and probably in Luxembourg as well. I mean, that's the thing. You turn a corner and you're in a different country around there.
I'm doing the triangle.
Wonderful. Thanks everybody for listening. We'll see you all very soon. Cheerio.
Cheerio.
See ya.